Okay, you can go ahead and start your talk.
Good morning. Thank you for tuning in into Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Dov Boros and I'm a Holocaust survivor. I was born in Budapest in 1932 into a family of fairly well off financially. My father was a mid-level administrator in one of the largest publishing companies in Hungary. And I was a only child for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. I was obedient, I was a good student at the school, and things went very nicely. Unfortunately, in 1941-42, there were several severe anti-Jewish laws enacted by the Hungarian government, according to which the second one, my father as a Jew could not be kept into his position and he was literally ushered out. Well, from then on, things went so-so, and eventually we actually were in dire financial need. He was taken away in 1941 to the Ukraine because the Hungarian government pledged 50,000 Jewish auxiliary workers to be sent out as an auxiliary force to the Hungarian army, who were heavily in fight with the Russians. Now, the help was actually removing with bare hands mines which were laid down by the Russians, and there were a lot of casualties. Jews were actually killed by the Hungarian soldiers. Many were literally shot. So in fact, it was an unbelievably hair-raising event. And eventually, after the whole front collapsed, only out of the 50,000, 6,000 remained alive. Fortunately, my father was one of them. Now, during the first year, in 1940, the Germans invaded Hungary, March, and because they did not believe in the solidity of the collaboration with Nazi Germany, and the German army invaded, and they were really a fairly large army dispersed all over the city, and we felt that things are not going well and who knows what will happen. Well, what happened was that the Hungarian government started putting out orders. The order was that Jews had to leave their original lodgings, and we were sent, sort of coerced, going into a living into designated houses, which were only for Jews, and usually 1 or 2 families, if not more, were jammed into one apartment, and that was our way of living. We had to live with only a small suitcases in order to sustain ourselves. Everything else had to be left behind. Now, that was the first step. The second step was that we had to put out the Star of David, a yellow Star of David, as to identify as Jewish, and we had all our outer clothing had to bear the yellow Star of David. Finally, there was a curfew during the day. We had only 2 hours free time to go shopping, perhaps medical attention, etc. The rest, we were jammed into those apartments, and the gates were locked. We could not move in and out. Now, as things went on, well, we were 6, 8 kids in that house. So we sort of got together and they played all kinds of games, but it wasn't really fun. And it started to be hot. It went to slowly to summertime, and still no getting out. Well, things were heated up by no less than the American Army Air Force. During that time, the Americans who were already based in Italy and they could fly up to Hungary, the Americans sent heavy bomber brigades to Budapest, and they bombed Budapest day and night, day and night. We couldn't even get out of the air raid shelter because it was dangerous. The bombardments left behind a terrific damage in the city. And as an aftermath, we, the young ones, the young Jewish boys, girls, were sent out by force to help out in clearing the rubble. Now that was a tricky thing because there were huge boulders and there were the bombs fell into houses, 6-story houses, and there was a lot of incidental damage. My damage became, unfortunately, as I was pulling in one of these little sort of boulders, I slipped and got a gash of wound on my left leg. Now that profusely was bloody. I was sent to a first aid station, and for the next 2 months, I had to go in from time to time and getting bandages. It was a very unpleasant situation. Now, after a while, the bombardments stopped, and a little bit the curfew was relieved, so we could, instead of all day long, we were closeted in, we could go about 4 hours free time out in the city. Well, things went, during the summer, things went a little bit better. The Hungarian government felt that actually the war is near because the Russians broke through the Hungarian and German lines. And they rolled these two armies, they were annihilated, at least in a good part. And they were rolling towards Hungary. So they started to change the tune a little bit against the Jews, and they tried all kinds of alleviations and things, but by and large, we were still remaining sort of prisoners in those houses. In October 15, the dramatic event happened. Admiral Horthy, the head of the Hungarian government and the ruler, went on the radio and announced that Hungary, as of now, is out of the hostilities against the Russian army. And well, it was fantastic. We just ran out, you know, we opened the gates, everybody ran out of the Jewish houses, and there was actually dancing and singing. It was great merriment. We thought that the war is over. Well, not so. Within hours, Horthy was jailed, and so were his sons. And the Hungarian government as such was deposed. And instead, the most vicious, the most rabidly anti-Semitic party, the Aerocross, came into power and immediately started breaking into the Jewish houses. The idea was always to grab as much money and jewelry from the Jews as is possible, and the rest could be killed. And that's what it felt, what it was. They came into our house, collected jewelry, left. Some of the less lucky were accompanied to the bank of the Danube, and they were shot into the water. So it was mass murder of the Jews during those during the first days and the first weeks. Now, We were afraid and we didn't know what to do, whether to leave and flee, but where to. We didn't have anywhere to go. So we stayed on. And the next evening, there was banging on the gate and let us in, let us in. Well, we opened the gate. We thought that the Hungarian Aerocross brigands are coming. No, they weren't. They were the German army. And we were flabbergasted. What of that? Anyway, they came in and immediately, for reasons that we don't know, they knew that we were in the air raid shelter. The Jews came straight down and went from shelter to shelter because we left actually the air raid shelter and everyone was trying to hide, quote unquote, in our individual shelters where we had coal and kindlewood, etc., and junks stored. Now, they came to my shelter, our shelter. We were there, my mother, my 4-year-old brother, and me. And they said in German, heraus, heraus, getting out. I didn't move fast enough and got a terrific blow on the shoulder here that on a humid day, even today, I feel the massive weight of the as it was, the blow, and it's still aching. Okay, so we were collected into a larger room, everybody, and in came a Gestapo officer. Gestapo were the Secret Service anti-crime detection unit of the German army. So the Gestapo came in and he ordered all the women, mostly women and young children, out. We stayed about the 8 youngsters, sort of, 8 boys stayed in. Now, and he started interrogating in German. What happened was that our leader, who was a 16-year-old, we were 12, 16-year-old, he had a German mother, and he spoke impeccable German. That was excellent, because we could converse or interact with the Gestapo guy. But it was bad because the Gestapo guy immediately suspected that we are spies, even though 12-year-old spies, and spies parachuted from London for various activities, anti-Hungarian activities. So, and he started interrogating who sent us from London, when did we arrive, what were the original aims, and we were flabbergasted. We said, look, we don't know anything. We were just living here as Jews, and according to the law, and there is nothing to it. We are not spies. We never spied. And it went on, and he got angrier and angrier because every question we refused, said, it's not so, it's not so, you are mistaken. Actually, the joke was on him because I was involved in an underground activity. There was a lot of demand for forged documents that Jews wanted, saying they are not Jewish. And these documents were forged, birth certificates, etc., fairly skillfully. Some were not too good. And they were sort of, after it was printed, they came to our house, dropped, and we had to sort of make it looking older. And we crumpled it and creased it, etc. And eventually they came again, picked it up, and transported it. As it turned out later, they made good money on it. We didn't know about it. Anyway, so I was involved in the underground movement. I kept mum. I didn't say anything. Anyway, a long story short, after half an hour or so, the Gestapo guy became red in the face, started shouting in German that we are pigs and we don't have to live. And last time he's asking, how did we get into Hungary? And we said, we were born in Hungary. What of it? Anyway, he ordered us to turn around, hands up like that, facing the wall, and said, because you didn't admit anything, you will be executed. Wow. So he called in two army guys with a Schmeisser sort of, yeah. It was a more or less like it's not worth dwelling on it. Sort of like a machine gun, and they cocked the machine gun, and you know, I was unbelievably scared. That's an unbelievable situation that at age 12, you are facing death. And as I was waiting, my last thoughts were regret. Regret, I'll never see my parents, my brother, I'll never be able to realize my aims. And we were waiting. It was not a long wait, about a minute. And I was sort of afraid, you know, feeling where the bullet were penetrating into my back. No, that didn't happen. The captain who came over with the 15 German army came in and saw these terribly scared children and asked in German, "What is Lord? What's happening here?" And the Gestapo guy said, "These are spies who would not admit that they are doing spying activity and they are being executed." Well, he didn't have a good day because the captain was in charge of the unit, and the Gestapo agent could not give an order of execution. He chased out the Gestapo guy, looked at us. He didn't believe one word as us being sort of resistant workers. And after a while, he said, "Everybody back up into the courtyard," and we were lined up. He wanted to take us into their lodging, which was a public school, and for further interrogation. Well, we waited. That didn't come about. He said, "Everybody back up to their apartments." So we went up, exhausted, and tried to sleep. It took more than 20 years for me to again take enough sort of mental energy to go and visit Hungary. And I went and for the same house where we were, and I visited the school where we were to be taken. On the wall of that school, there was a note, a plaque. In this school, 30 Jews were killed, and it was a day after we were to be taken there. So it was really a matter of just luck that for some reason the captain didn't want to execute us. Okay, we went back, and my mother, who was very astute woman, said, "Look, we cannot stay here because the Aerocross would come time and time again, and that would be the end of us." So we waited a day, and sure enough, the Aerocross came back, and we were on foot, sort of chased throughout half of Budapest into one of the horse race tracks at the edge of the city. And there were at least 10,000 people already collected. The good people of Budapest at the curbs were shouting at us, "Dirty Jews, death to the Jews," and they were spitting at us, and etc. So we arrived, and there was a sort of a, if you will, a leader of the unit, of the Aerocross unit, and he stood at the one of these tribunes, and he made an impromptu speech of, again, "Dirty Jews, you are parasites of Hungary, you suck the blood of Hungary long enough, and we'll execute you today." Well, from one execution to another, So we went around and around and around like where the horses would be running. And after a while, he said, everybody is going into the inner circle and sit down. And it went, this tirade went on and on, how we will be executed. And outside the horse race track was very close to the railway lines. And we could hear how the wagons were shuttled back and forth. And we said, okay, so we'll be probably sent out. Well, that was the original idea. They could not send towards Auschwitz, the favorite place, because Auschwitz was already in the hands of the enemy. So, well, we sat somewhere, we don't know. We never went anywhere because there were not enough wagons for 10,000 or 15,000 people. Okay, so spend the night sort of, sitting on the ground. It was October, it was fairly cold. And after a while, in the morning, again, very brief, they said, everybody going home. Well, okay, we went home. And then my mother said, okay, that proves that we should leave from here. Now, there was a fairly easy connectivity with other Jewish ladies and gents, old. And one of our friends said, look, we just heard that there were Jewish houses, or rather like international houses, which were kept to save Jews. And there were the Swedish, the Swiss, which were the most prestigious and jam-packed completely. And there were a few like Portuguese, Vatican, and Spanish. Now we, as luck would have it, we got a Spanish sort of cover in which we got later a paper that these individuals are under the protection of the Spanish government and no one should harm them. They didn't help much, but eventually at the first hour or two, it could have helped. And we were there, arrived, and we were accepted. And there was a small washing room, sort of for 30 people, bunk beds. And they said, well, that is your future home. And we got very good food daily. And we got blankets and things. So that was our new life away from the Arrow Cross. Well, it looked good because it was already November, late November. And we were waiting what would be our fate. And, there were ideas that would we survive or not. And many said, well, it's unlikely survival. Some said, yes, if we are lucky enough. You see, we were at the outskirts, as later it turned out that the Russian army broke through into the city exactly at that point. So all we had to do is just sort of hunker down and wait and luck. Well, we didn't have luck. Somebody who was, there was always somebody, an idiot, went out without anything that he would tell us or something, and he got mad, and the Arrow Cross started beating him. And he said, oh yeah, I came out from this and that thing, and there are 30 Jews. Well, next day, indeed, the Arrow Cross arrived with 2 wolf dogs, and they didn't ask anything. They decided that they would just take us to the ghetto. At that time, the ghetto was in the middle of Budapest, the one-time Jewish district, and we were marched again, on foot to arrive to the ghetto, a good hour and a half, almost 2 hours marching, very difficult holding the 40-year-old kid. And eventually we ended up in one of these big 6-story buildings, and there was nothing, no place to go. So we got in the air raid shelter sort of barely a space for myself and the kid and me, and blankets, and that was our life for the next 2 months. We got fed 3 times a week, day, 3 times a day, which was thin soup and a slice of bread. It wasn't enough, and as a matter of fact, we started slowly losing weight, day after day after day. Now, I became sort of a clever guy, and I realized that the food came in, it was supplied by the Red Cross and the Hungarian Budapest sort of government. So I saw that it was difficult to bring in these huge containers with the soup, and I sort of volunteered as a 12-year-old to go up with them and push the pushcart, help the pushcart in order to come in. And they accepted it as a payment. I was paid with a slice or 2 of bread and a little bit more soup. That came very handy because my little brother Peter was voraciously hungry and we could not eat enough. And we always saved some of our meals, a little bit, in order to give it to him. Okay, things went fairly well, except the Russians made a very rapid entry into the city itself. And there were street fighting between the 2 armies, and by sort of, let's say, mid-December, they broke through and were very close to the ghetto. Now, the ghetto was bombarded and shelled by the German army because there were some Germans and some Hungarian army within the ghetto. So the bringing in food became more and more dangerous, but we had to do it because there was nothing else to do. There was nothing else to eat. And as a consequence of the rapid advancement of the Russian army, the food supply stopped. So, or at least slowed down. So what happened was that the little food, there was not enough anyway, was even less. At the beginning, it was only twice a day, and eventually once a day. So it was really an unbelievable situation because some of the people started dying out. It was not enough. And of course, we became completely thin and sort of very weak. And eventually in January, we sort of, held on until January. And in January 15, 16, someone broke into the air raid shelter and shouted, "The Russians are here, the Russians are here." It turned out there was a huge din for 2 days. The Russians indeed invaded throughout the German and the Hungarian army and invaded the ghetto. Well, I went up just as a nosy guy, and indeed, there were Russian soldiers laying down the telephone cables. The Russians were here, indeed. So I asked my mother, "What now?" Well, we said, let's wait a day. They would come and feed us, and then we can continue on from here. Well, we waited a day, nothing. They waited an additional half a day, nothing. They couldn't care less about us feeding the Jews. They had to go on with their own mission to clean out Budapest. So I said, let's go back to the last one, into the Jewish home, where we were for the past months we were there. We went back, unbelievable, it was heavy snow. We were sitting down on the snow from time to time in order to have a little bit strength. It took us about 2 miles, took us half a day until we made it back. And we had still the key. Those who were living there were evacuees, Hungarian evacuees who were fleeing their own home, and they got the apartment. They left because they were afraid of the Russians, and that was our luck. The apartment was all for us, for the three of us, and as a godsend, as it were, if I may say so, they left behind some dry bread, some biscuits, some flour. There was in the bathroom, there was still water. So my mother, who was again very, very quick and astute woman, said, well, we have to eat something. So she prepared some, with the flour, something, and noodles. We ate after 4 or 5 days of complete starvation. We ate suddenly, and it was good, and we were, quieted down. For the next 3.5, 4 days, we were feasting on the treasures that were left behind. There were some dried peas and dried beans, and there was fire, there was kindlewood. So we could really prepare very rudimentary meals, but we were alive. Now, at the end of we went through all whatever it was there to be edible, and I saw what's the situation. And I said, I'll be now the breadwinner, literally the breadwinner. So I took a cover of a big cover of something and went out daily. First of all, I needed kindlewood for heating. So there was a big basin with water to be prepared against incendiary bombs, which they felt to put out the fire. I went there, fortunately, at that time, no one was around. I took whatever it was, probably a whatever, and I started breaking down the tents. And I took as many as I could, and I went several trips. It was a 15-hour walk each time. And I brought in as much kindlewood as I could. I did it for 2 days. The third day, it turned out that other agile individuals realized that there is some kindlewood to be had, and they participated, and in a day and a half, everything went. So we didn't have enough kindlewood more for the further days. Anyway, I went out with this coverlet, and I turned into a sort of, I insist till today, I wasn't really a looter. I was a scavenger, meaning that I went after the looters. Stores were looted by the hundreds in Budapest. And the stores that were selling something one time, they were, of course, the major items to be broken in. So I went after them, and indeed, as a scavenger, I could collect, from whatever they slashed open bags with food, with peas, beans, etc. Whatever was left behind on the floor, sometimes on the snowy floor, I took it and collected. So it went on from place to place to place to place. Sometimes it was a few margarines. Sometimes it was a additional flour. So for some reason, and for my agility, I could sustain my family, the three of us, with all these things that I brought in, and my mother cooked it up and they ate. Well, at least once I met my previous classmate, who were alive still, and he was very glad to see me and invited me a very good meal. They had plenty of money and they bought the best things that they could. And I said, well, I am coming up to eat only on one occasion, that at least I can take something back home. Okay, they said, so they gave me plenty to take home. Again, it was good for a few days. And what happened that the city started to come alive, more and more shops started opening up, especially bakery and grocery. And that was good because people were very starved and there was no source where to get things from. So as a consequence, the stores were slowly cleaned out, the looted stores. So what happened was that one could now stand in line and hope to get some freshly baked bread or some grocery. The trick was to know where you were standing and what time. People were lining up from 5:30 in the morning, standing in the snow. The snow was my enemy, became my enemy, because my shoes from all this walking back and forth fell apart. So I had to take some strings and tie the soles onto the upper structure of the shoe in order to be able to commute back and forth. So it was really some story, standing in the leaking shoes and waiting sometimes hours. And by and large, I was lucky, after 2 hours waiting, 3 sometimes, I got half a loaf of bread. We had to pay for it, but we had some money, not much, but some money to pay. Good. So it went on for the next, I would say, 2 weeks or so. And it was the end of January, it was February, end of February. And we waited and waited. What now? Well, what happened was an unbelievable story. My father, who was taken to a copper mine in Serbia as an additional, once returning from the Ukraine, he was taken in turn to the Serbian copper mine, and he disappeared for months, and we didn't know what happened to him, and we thought he's actually long dead. And he came very much alive. It turned out that he was to be executed by the Germans before they left, because they were fleeing from the Serbian partisans. And it was really a touch and go, because they took with themselves at least 200, 300 Jews, and they took them on foot, forced march, and eventually in the neighboring village, all 300 were killed. My father was actually, the things that can happen. He reported that he is not able to march, making the march. So they were put into a big stable, and the stable was locked. And the idea was that the stable would be lit up and with some hand grenade or something, and we would be being roasted in the stable. Them, not me. Well, that didn't happen, because as soon as the last German pulled out their legs, the partisans came down, opened the stable, and took us with them into a safe place. They fed us. I'm sorry, it's not us, it's my father. I'm lapsing back in the time element, my father. And eventually my father, we had relatives in Romania, he arrived in Romania, and the Romanian jury did better than the Hungarian. There's some were alive, still many were alive. And imagine my father arriving with some food, and she learned where we are from the lady who suggested where to go with the group into the Spanish house. So anyway, we were delirious, and he had long stories, etc. He stayed for 2 days, and he said, you know, let's just go to Romania. That is the way to go, because that is the easiest, and the trains were still free. You just have to hustle in, wait at the station, and sort of hustle in, and standing, you will be taken to Romania, which is about a 5-6 hour ride on the train. So fine, we arrived to Romania. They were very glad to see us, the remaining relatives, and both my father and my mother knew Romanian because they were born in Arad, which was of course a Hungarian city, but that became, after the First World War, Romanian territory. So as a matter of fact, they could converse with the Romanians. We got temporary documents of stay, and we were waiting sort of until the situation becomes better in Budapest. And we were there for about, let's say we arrived early March, and March, April, May. In May, we heard that the situation is much improved in Budapest, and furthermore, the schools were opening up. You see, the schools were closed as soon as the Germans came. So there was no teaching and no learning. And the idea was that we go back, the schools were open, and I went back to my gymnasium, 3rd grade, and it was probably a month and a half or what of stay there. And of course, I couldn't get much material, but the point was that I had to get and make up that last year in somehow. And what happened was that 2 of the teachers who remained alive suggested themselves or their sons as teachers to help us to prepare me or us for the school. In other words, they wanted to make up the lost 3rd grade of gymnasium. Okay, so I studied all throughout the summer, and my father, of course, went back to looking for jobs, and he succeeded to get some temporary, later not so temporary work, and we had salary, we had more money, so the situation improved. We were the family where the few families remained intact and alive, so it was good. And okay, I finished the 3rd grade, not swimmingly good, but reasonable, and went on 4th and 5th and 6th, etc., and wanted to graduate from the Hungarian Jewish high school. Well, when I finished, the situation became bad because the Hungarian government turned communist. And it was a very severe early communistic regime. We had to, out of in the Jewish gymnasium, we had to march out with red banners and shouting, long live Stalin, etc., etc. And the point was that slowly the Jews were again perhaps not limited in entry like during the Nazi era, but were not really accepted with open arms. And there were a lot of jumpers to go to the university eventually. So, and I didn't really wanted to live in Hungary any longer. So as a matter of fact, I joined a Zionist group, Hashomer HaTzair, and they told me, look, there are at least transports organized by the Hashomer HaTzair to take youngsters to Palestine. Palestine, or rather, at that time, for the early days of the declaration of the Jewish state. So I said, well, fine, let's do it. There was an upheaval at home. My mother was absolutely without consolation that I want to leave and leave them. And my father was sort of iffy, but he said, well, if you decide you think you would have a better, I said, I don't want to be a communist. So he said, if you want a better future, try to go to Israel. So we went. Well, it's not so easy. We were actually smuggled by the organization through the Hungarian border into Slovakia. And it was a very touch and go situation because the border was very secure. And there were Hungarian and Slovak soldiers marching up and down to see that it would be not permeable for anyone just crossing through. The point is that eventually we arrived to Bratislava, and from there to Vienna, and from Vienna to Bari. At Bari, we boarded a fairly small ship, and we were taken to Israel. Well, Israel, I went to a kibbutz and worked very hard during the first months because it was a very hot summer, and we were sent out to well, I was first sent to a stable with the cows, and it was an unbelievable job to remove all the dung and everything and clean the premises. Well, I did it for a month. And then I was sent out into the fields to clean the fields from the occasional rocks, which were somehow everywhere, in order to prepare it as a field for throwing something there. Anyway, I did it for a couple of months, 3 months, and I said, look, what about my studies? I finished high school. What about the studies? I would like to study medicine. And they said, look, there is no such a thing. No such a thing. You work here, you can be fed, that's it. So I decided that's not for me. In the meanwhile, I of course got in touch with my aunt, the sister of my father, and they said, look, if you want, come to our place, you can stay there, and we'll see what's happening. So I left the kibbutz, went to Jerusalem, and went in all kinds of unbelievable works, preparing situations for buildings. I eventually went into a big company where they built, building new buildings, and I fell into a huge, fairly recently dug hole, and it looked like it was really that I would be maimed for life. I got here and here severe bumps on my bones. Anyway, to make a long story short, I survived, and eventually I went to an entrance exam into the Hebrew University medical school, and miraculously I got in. And for the next 4 years, I worked as a night watchman and made some money, bring it home to the family, and I finished first degree of in the medical school, and well, I met in the meanwhile a very nice girl, and we went out for a while, and then we married, and two beautiful daughters were born. So things looked good. I became an assistant director of an institute. With my diploma, I could do it as a professional. And as a consequence, well, I could have stayed forever. But I was restless. And as such, I said, well, I would like a year of from the United States, but everyone went for further post bachelor's studies. Okay, so it was sort of a good possibility, but they wouldn't let me go. They said, look, either you stay, or if you leave, you would be fired. Well, I said, fire me. My young wife very stoutly and very beautifully said, I'll stand by you and we'll make it. And it was, yes, you will return and we'll find you a new job. Well, anyway, we went to the United States and I worked in two medical schools in research. And both said, well, would you like to stay? And I said, well, we'd like to go back to Israel. We went back to Israel, looking around for me to a job, nothing. They were very nasty. They said, well, I told you so. Don't leave because your job was filled up. So, to make a longer story, I stayed in the United States and the girls grew up, they got married, and we became sort of settled American citizens. Now, that is the story. And I have as a conclusion, one or two sentences things. Sentence number one, be resilient. Be resilient from unbelievable situations if you should be able to bounce back into normal life. And above all, stand up against any anti-Semitic or any anti-religion hatred. Fight it and fight against discrimination and prejudice. Thank you.
All right. We do have a couple questions.
Ready?
So if you're up for it, the first question is from Janet. And she
Yes.
says, looking back, how do you think you were able to handle all the stress and turmoil?
I just said I never knew the word resilience, but I was a resilient little guy. After starvation, I came back from starvation. We came back alive from the ghetto, and in Israel it was anything but an easy country. I had to hustle there, being a night watchman and going at 8 a.m. to the university to study. It was an unbelievable stress. So frankly, I have been living with stress for the past 60 years or more. Why? Because studying was very stressful at the same time, pairing it off with night work. So, it's, and of course, coming to the United States and learning how to do research work. And my boss was an absolutely amiable guy, a slave driver. He wanted, as according to the joke, research work done for yesterday, scheduled for tomorrow. So it was very, very stressful. Whenever he came into the lab and said, what's up? My bones were chilled because I had to say, well, it's not yet done, not yet done. Anyway, it was not easy. And, even eventually I ended up as full professor. As such, I had to worry about every 2 to 3 years bringing in money for research. My salary was assured, but not my work. Without money, they would bounce me up. So that is the story. It was a life full of endless stresses.
Amazing. One more question we have is from Courtney. How and why did you get involved with the Holocaust Museum?
Well, it's easy. One day, a gentleman came and he said, well, you know, I am at the Holocaust Museum and I am just a, you know, personnel, and I'm an American, I'm not a survivor. But they are looking still for the few survivors. You see, because I was 12 years old when I survived, only a few at my age were still alive. So therefore they said, go and if you want to be a survivor and give your story for Michigan kids, go and enroll. And I went, I met Amanda Friedemann, and they tested me if I'm good. I was good. And for the next 3 or 4 years, I went probably 2 or 3 times sometimes in a month to give my story and to answer questions for the Michigan kids who were totally alien to anything of my background as a Jew, my survival, but I impress on them, look, that is no joke to survive in any situation. You need pluck and you need resilience and you need strong determination to stay alive.
And we've got another one from Courtney. She says that she has some friends who are hesitant to ask questions of Holocaust survivors because they don't want to offend or bring up bad memories. So as a survivor, how do you like to be approached by people who are curious about your story?
Well, you know, it took some time to get used to it. Immediately after the liberation from the ghetto and everything else and the starvation, I had post-traumatic stress disorder without knowing that is it for about 2 years. I was suddenly startled by for any noise. I was sleepless for at least a year. So it was really, I was under stress, started to sort of digest the terrible things that happened to me. And as such, you know, telling over and over and over again the same story was very unpleasant. And my children never heard my story. I said, well, I don't want to burden you with that. Eventually they said, that's not right. You tell it to the alien kids, you know, in Michigan. And so I invited them, they came, they heard it. And that's the story. It's not a pleasant thing to tell and not a pleasant thing to rake it over and over and over again. But I do it because I think it's my job and my responsibility to, as a memory for all those who are not around, that I spread that story, and perhaps somebody can learn from my situation and put it to good use.
Very powerful answer. One last question. How are you doing in quarantine?
I am restless. I'm restless, and I read and I, you know, watch TV, and I try to put my memories in order. You know, I never wrote up my life story essentially. So yeah, it's not nice. It's not good. I have 2 daughters here in the city. We came to be with them years ago, which was very lucky. And so I ate meals for the older daughter with the younger daughter. And, you know, it's slowly, months after months, it's situation. I don't think it's getting better. I'm an immunologist. I know what's happening. And if it's going up again, the second wave, until the winter time, it may not get better. That's it. It's not easy. But I was there, you know, at age 12, that we were closeted in, and no outing anyway. So that's it. Yeah.
All right, and that's all the questions we have today. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. Okay. Goodbye. Oh, do I read it again?